Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.
The interview series, Reflections in Time, was begun by the late Professor Paul Borghi more than 15 years ago. This new series continues Paul's work and is dedicated to his memory. This is how Paul began many of the 73 interviews that he recorded. It's often exciting to look at the future of UNO, what it might be like in times to come. Sometimes, though, it's important to stop and take a look at the past of the university, the people and the happenings that helped make the excitement of future history possible. With this in mind, join me for Reflections in Time. My name's Jack Newton. I'm retired now, but I'm still active as a professor emeritus. I've been on the faculty of UN Omaha since 1960. And I served for 20 years as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. I worked closely with Professor Borghi in the development of his original interview series, and I can think of no more fitting tribute to him than to continue his work. Well, here we are in the KYNE studios. It's towards the end of towards the end of September. In the year 2000, we have a beautiful sunny day outside, and I have here as my guest, this is my guest today, Dr. Elaine Hess, who has been at the university for a good many years. She's retired now, but you came to the university, I think, Elaine, in 1965, is that it?
In the fall of '65.
And then you were here for a short while, and then you left us for a while, and then you came back again. You were a faculty member in the sociology department at UNO.
That's right.
And you began as an instructor, if I recall, and then an assistant professor.
Actually, I was an instructor because I didn't finish my doctorate, and one of the reasons that I left here after 3 years was to go back and finish the doctorate, and I did, and I came back in 1970, which sort of surprised me because when I left I had not anticipated coming back, but I ended up being back in Omaha.
Well, you've had a number of jobs here at the university, and we'll talk about those. But you were Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs for a long time. That's how I got to know you best when I was Dean, and you worked for my boss, the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. Then you were even a department chairman in the sociology department for a couple of years. So and I'd almost forgotten you were acting dean of the College of Fine Arts for a year. I think that's, so that is an interesting background at UNO. But let's start in by talking a little bit about your roots. I know you come from Illinois. Can you tell us something about where you grew up?
Well, I grew up in Peoria, Illinois, right in the middle of the state. I ended up going to Illinois State Normal University, which is in Bloomington Normal, Illinois. At that time, it was entirely a teacher's college. I got a Bachelor of Science in Education degree with a major in Social Sciences. And
that was what year?
In 1956. I had finished my degree work in 3 years, and because I had some mentors who thought I really should do graduate work, I did 1 year of graduate work and decided I really wasn't ready. And I went back and I taught high school for 3 years, and then I went back to my alma mater and taught, or didn't teach, I supervised student teachers in the university high school there for a year, which was a temporary position, and one of the reasons I took it was because I thought that would force me to get back to graduate school. So I returned to Nebraska in the fall of '61 and worked on my master's degree, finished it in about 1.5 years, and then started work on my doctorate. And as I say, I first got to Nebraska mainly because one of my mentors in undergraduate school had received his doctorate. The choices I had to make were between Northwestern and Nebraska. The other mentor had gotten his PhD from Northwestern. And when it came to the offers that I got to do graduate work, Northwestern offered me a nice assistantship, but you had to pay your tuition. And as you can guess, at a private school, the tuition was very high at Northwestern. So since the offer from Nebraska included exemption from tuition, I came to Nebraska. Never had been west of the state of Illinois at the time.
You said you had a couple years of high school teaching there. Did you enjoy that?
Oh, yes, great deal. Probably enjoyed the teaching more at high school level.
And you were teaching what?
This was a rather unusual.
Science?
I was teaching sociology and psychology
to
undergraduates. I mean, to seniors in high school, juniors by permission, all college prep. A large number of them, their parents were some way on the staff at the University of Illinois. I had no discipline problems. It was a wonderful teaching experience. And in fact, in many ways, I enjoyed it more than college teaching. There was a certain naivete and a kind of earnestness about these young people at that time. Of course, you have to remember, that was in the 50s, and students have changed a great deal since then.
So you got your master's degree then at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln in 1963. Okay. And then you went on and, well, between then and the time you came back to start your doctoral work,
Well, I didn't really start again. I was working on my doctorate, and I had a chance to come to Omaha to take a position on a research project at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. At that time, it was all one university. And I thought, well, this is going to be ideal. I can work, and I can also travel to Lincoln to work on take seminars, for example. So I came up here actually in January of '64 and was at the Medical Center for about a year and a half. And then came to what that time was the University of Omaha in the fall of ~65. So I had about a year and a half. And of course now, UNO at that time was not UNO, it was University of Omaha. But later, when it became UNO, I was always one that could say I'd been employed by all three campuses of the university. Of course now there's 4, so I can't say that. But I came originally to Omaha to work at the Medical Center.
Well, you were there right in the middle then of the tumultuous time that we had when we had, well, maybe even for the mill levy campaigns, but certainly for the change from municipal to a state university.
Yes, I left in the summer of '68, which was actually the merger went into effect in July 1 of '68. So I left just as the merger was taking place, and I came back 3 years later, which was an interesting period to be gone, because when I came back, you could really see the changes, simply because I had been absent for 3 years. So I left just at the time it became part of the university.
What were some of those changes that you noticed?
Well, first of all, the number of students. It was dramatic. The enrollment had increased overnight, practically.
Yeah, I remember about 25%. Or so.
That's right. The place was starting to grow, I mean, physically grow. I believe that was at the time, it was Kaiser Hall, I think, went up at about that time.
Yeah, in '68 it was Allwine Hall.
Oh, I mean Allwine Hall. The Allwine Hall was the first one to go up, right after the merger. And of course, before that, it was, we had the Student Center, we had the old administration building, which is now Arts and Sciences, we had engineering, we had the field house, and we had a lot of Quonset huts. And the Quonset huts were, in fact, in front of the engineering building, between Dodge Street and the engineering building. It was all filled up with, well, they weren't Quonset huts in the sense that they weren't the rounded, they weren't the rounded types, but they had actually been old barracks.
We had those too, though.
Yes, there were some back by the,
was in there.
Yeah. But no, there have been very limited physical facilities when I left, and of course it was starting to change dramatically when I came back. And as I said, I think the most dramatic change that occurred was the number of students and the number of new faculty they were hiring. And also, I think there was a big change in the quality of the faculty we were hiring at that time. I mean, there was a sense in which I think, becoming part of the university, we could attract some people that we couldn't attract before. And certainly the standards for faculty hires and faculty performance were increasing tremendously.
Now, you've told us why you decided to go to graduate school in Lincoln and how you happened to come to work at the medical center. How did you end up at Omaha University?
Well, I was working at the medical center. The grant probably had another 6 months to go, which would have been awkward in the middle of the year to leave. I heard that they had a position open at Omaha University, and I inquired, and I thought that would be nice. I wouldn't have to move, and yet I could still travel to Lincoln and to take seminars and finish my doctorate. So I took the position here, mainly because of the convenience, and it was also, as I say, available at that time. I didn't know anything about Omaha U, even though I'd been here a year and a half. Being over at the Med Center, I really had no contact, so I didn't really know much about the Omaha University before I came here.
We talked a little bit about changes that you saw later when after what we sometimes speak of as the merging of Omaha University with the state system. But can you reminisce a little about what it was like when you first came here, when it was still Omaha University? That was when Mabel L was president in 1965, wasn't it?
No, Mabel L had just stepped down as president. Just retired, and Dr. Leland Trawick was the new chancellor, or president, as he was called at that time. And I remember some of the old faculty reflecting on how things had changed when Dr. Trawick had come in, mainly in terms of, they said that we had much nicer social occasions. The Christmas party, for example, they were very impressed with that. They also, for example, felt that, well, there weren't as many limitations on the faculty as there had been under Dr. Bale. But in general, as I say, they were fairly positive. Now, Dr. Trawick was only president for about 2 years, and he, no, that's right, he was only, I think, 2 years.
Very short time.
Yeah, 2 years. And then Kirk Naylor, who was sort of, well, he had been...
he was originally Dean of Administration with
under Milo Bale. And he was named acting president of the university when Trawick left. And he was still acting president when I left UNO, which is in 1968. So I think it was Trawick was there 2 years, and then Dr. Naylor was in for 1 year. But as I say, I don't really remember that much. I remember, I suppose, the one thing I remember about that period of time, and even, of course, when I came back, were the bootstrap students. I had never experienced so many older students in my classes.
Bootstrap students were military people who were here on administrative leave for up to a year or so.
And some of them were here for even longer.
Finished degrees in that time.
They were excellent students. They worked hard. You never had to worry about them not finishing their work, or, you know, they were just ideal students.
Yes, I remember them very well. That arose from an agreement that Dr. Bale had worked out, I think,
with Kurt LeMay.
With General LeMay, right. Yeah. And of course, because Strategic Air Command was here, and General LeMay was here, and he and Milo Bale evidently
now, it expanded, of course, other than the Air Force, because although there were smaller numbers, but I had people that were connected with the Army, and I also had one person who was a lieutenant colonel in the Marines as a student once. And some of these people did come back more than once, because I remember one student I got to know particularly well who had been here, got his degree, and then was sent back to Vietnam. He was a helicopter pilot. And between assignments in Vietnam, they didn't have much for him to do in the United States, so they'd let him go back to school. And he came back and finished his master's degree in psychology. And I've always wondered whether he went to finish his doctorate or not, because at the time he was always talking about doing that. But yeah, we had a large number of those students, and I had a large number in my classes.
They were highly motivated.
Well, not only motivated, but they knew that their whole appraisal or their evaluation for the military during that time they were here was based on their grades. And if they were going to get promoted in rank, they had to perform well.
Well, there was an up or out policy, and they didn't get promoted without a degree, I think.
That's right.
That was it.
But it also, in terms of just simply general performance, their grades here were the primary standard by which they were judged. And in a way, it almost became too competitive because of that.
Yep. The other students sometimes, the younger students sometimes got a little annoyed.
They always called the bootstrappers the curve busters.
That's right. How many faculty members were there in the sociology department back then?
When I first got here, well, when I first got here, social work was combined with sociology. And when I first got here, I think there was only one person in social work. When I came back, I think there were two people in social work. Then there was one person in criminal justice. If I eliminate social work and criminal justice, I think there were maybe four or five faculty in sociology.
So about 7 or 8 people in the department, of which
3 of them were,
social work and criminal justice were represented. That's not nearly as large as it was when you left, is it?
No, the expansion has included, I don't remember there being, when I was here initially, there weren't any anthropologists, and now they have at least 2 anthropologists in the department. There certainly are more faculty total than there were at the time, but they've now incorporated anthropology, but criminal justice is now a department of its own, and social work is separate.
They moved the School of Social Work from Lincoln to
That's right, yeah. And there was only an undergraduate program in social work here at the time, and it was very limited.
Criminal justice grew into a very large program.
Yes.
It was fairly large when it was in sociology, wasn't it?
Yes, there was only one faculty member.
In terms of numbers of students.
There was only one faculty member, but they used a lot of part-time people. I remember some of the people in the local police force who were, I think one was public safety director, who was a part-time faculty member at the time, and they used a lot of part-time people.
Same was true of social work, I think. So,
yes, but as I say, it wasn't nearly as large, and it didn't grow until they moved the social work program, which was a graduate program at Lincoln. They moved it to UNO, and then, of course, it really grew.
Did it make a big difference to the department when those folks moved out into another college?
I don't know that it really made that much difference because...
In terms of departmental statistics, it certainly would.
Well, yes, but they were still listed as different curricula. I don't know that, and to a certain extent, for example, in social work, the sociologists did not really get involved in issues of curricula in social work. That was, you know, for the social workers to work out. And the same thing was true in criminal justice. They were sort of regarded as being part of the department, but on the other hand, there was a certain degree of autonomy, particularly in terms of curricular matters.
What was the curriculum in sociology like back then?
Oh, a fairly conventional, standard undergraduate curriculum. There was a very small graduate program. I suppose there were probably 5 or 6 students that were in graduate school at that time. Very, as I say, very, very small. At that time, they were largely some older people that were in graduate school. I think we were still getting some people that had been in the service coming back to do graduate work. The year I came, they hired another woman. This was an interesting story in of itself. They hired 2 women this year in the sociology department. This was the fall of '65. And under Milo Bale, as I said, Milo Bale had just left. Under Milo Bale, women, everybody shared offices. There were no private offices, or very few people had private offices. And there was a sort of unwritten rule under Milo Bale that men and women could not share offices, which created some problems because women frequently had to share offices with other women who were in another department. If there was only one woman in the department, you had to go over and have an office in another department. But they hired 2 women in the year I came in, and I think they sort of did this just to prove that they could. But they both had us sharing offices with different men. They didn't put us together. They could have put us together, but they did not. And I think it was because they just wanted to defy the tradition. And as a result, I shared an office with a psychologist, and she shared the office with one person in philosophy and one person in religion. But that we always laughed about it, that they, just to simply defy tradition, they put us in separate offices, where they could have had us share offices.
Well, when you first came here, what sorts of courses were you teaching?
Mainly, I taught some introductory. Everybody taught some introductory sociology, and I taught statistics, and I taught research methods. I think I may have taught a section 2 of social psychology. And I remember one time I taught a class in population dynamics, which was interesting. I had very little background, but I had a class made up entirely of bootstrappers. And it was a fascinating class because they all had to do some population study on a different country in the world. And most of these people had, you know, friends in the embassies in these countries, and they made all these contacts. They had the most recent data, and they used some of the facilities for creating, you know, beautiful maps and charts and so on that they brought to class. And the rest, you know, other undergraduate students simply couldn't compete. These were not the days when people had computers or anything, but they had access to all of this. And so I did teach one course in population dynamics. That was only one time, but it was a fun class simply because of the kind of students I had. I learned as much as they did.
And then you left the university for a while. And what did you do then?
I went back. I went to teach at the University of North Dakota for 1 year, and that was a mistake. Not because it was cold. I just didn't like the community. But while I was there, the person who was chair of the department down in Lincoln contacted me, and he said, you know, you're never going to finish that dissertation sitting up there in the cold climes of North Dakota. So he said, why don't you come down and work half-time for us? He said, I won't give you any other assignment other than half-time, because I know you won't finish your dissertation. But so he offered me the chance to come back for a year, which I did, and was very good because I did finish my doctorate as a result. I probably wouldn't have finished it. And it was also interesting in another way because he knew that it was going to be hard to live on half-time salary. So he said, I'll try to work out something for a summer assignment for you in the summer before I was to teach. And he had contacted Peter McGraw, who at that time was the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Lincoln, and who, by the time I got there, he was the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, however. And they cooked up an idea that I was to do a kind of feasibility study for a curriculum in science and public policy. And it was sort of a quasi-administrative job, and I found out I really enjoyed it. And I've always said that's probably the reason I ended up going into administration, because I had that experience. And I actually, as I say, I did that during the summer, and then I taught half-time for them in the fall and the spring, and I finished my doctorate in that year.
What brought you back then to what became the University of Nebraska at Omaha?
Well, the chairman contacted me, and he said, how is your degree going? And I said, well, it's about done. And he said, would you be interested in coming back? And I hadn't really anticipated it. But I had moved twice in 9 months, up to North Dakota and back, and I thought, oh, it would be nice just to not have to move so far. And so I looked into it, and I said, yeah, I'll come back.
Great.
And this was a new person. He hadn't been chairman when I was here, but he was now chairman of the department. I knew him quite well, and so they offered me a position, and I returned. And so I say I no longer, because I had the doctorate now, I no longer had to turn my head the other way when I'd run into Dean Harper in the hall, because Dean Harper was always after me. When are you going to get that degree done? And so I
used to
come
do
back.
the same thing when I was, you know,
so
not
I could
with you, but
I could come back as a full member of the faculty because I had the degree finished.
And then you. Let's see, what year was that when you came back?
I came back in fall of 1970, and I stayed.
That was right after you finished your degree.
That's right, and I stayed the rest of my career at UNO.
And you taught then in sociology for how many years?
3 years.
3 years.
And meanwhile, as I said, I had become interested in administration, and I thought, well, the only way to get involved and, to get noticed in terms of possible administrative assignment is become active in campus committees. And I happened to luck out in the sense that this was the time they were looking for women to serve on committees. And I was the person, I was willing to do it. And so I was on an unbelievable number of campus committees and the faculty senate and all sorts of things. And I think it was useful because I did get recognized. And then Dr. Roskins came in as the chancellor at UNO, and he called me in one day. I'd had some contact with him on the faculty senate, and he said, would you be interested in going to this administrative training institute in Ann Arbor? And I said, well, yes. So they sent me, and the university sent me, and I thought, well, that's a pretty good sign that they've made a commitment in that sense. They've already spent some money on me. So they sent me to Administrative Training Institute in Ann Arbor, and I came back.
Is that a good experience up there?
It was. It was a little long, but mainly because the the program went from early in the morning to late at night every day of the week. And it was a very intensive seminar.
So the university got their money's worth out of you. You did have to work. It wasn't all fun and games.
No, it was not. And I came back, and by that time, the university had changed its structure. There had been a dean of faculty before, but now they had named a vice chancellor for academic affairs, Dr. Herb Garfinkel, and he came in, and he put an announcement in some kind of a campus newsletter that they wanted to seriously consider applicants for the position of assistant vice chancellor. So I thought, well, I might as well risk it, so I applied for it.
Well, you and I know about the university structure. We know what a vice chancellor for academic affairs is, but I'm not sure everybody in our audience does. What does the vice chancellor do? Well,
actually, the university is sort of a triumvirate in a sense, that at that time there were 3 divisions: academic affairs, business and finance, and student affairs. And the Office of Academic Affairs is the office to which all the academic deans reported. They were in a sense, the division that handled all the supervision, the hiring, evaluation of faculty, all the curricular issues, anything that really impacted the fundamental mission of the university. Now, that I'm sure some of the people in the student affairs would disagree with that, but certainly the student affairs office was less, involved in the fundamental activities. It was considered really sort of a support area concerned with student behavior and student contact, but not particularly concerned with the student performance in the classroom. And so in academic affairs, basically, all the deans reported there, and all the curricular, budgetary, personnel issues dealing with the fundamental mission of the university came through academic affairs office.
So when you began working with Vice Chancellor Garfinkel, what were your duties?
Well, when I came in, I wasn't sure, and I don't think he was sure what I was going to do, because he was brand new too, right. and the position had just been created, right. Really too. So he pretty much let me initially define my own job, in the sense that when things would come up and I think I could handle them, I did them. Kept him informed, and gradually, I think, as we sort of arrived at a description of my role that way. Dr. Garfinkel was less talented when it came to things like dealing with the specifics of budgets. He wasn't as detail-oriented as I am, so it was obvious that I would take over certain areas. He was more the intellectual. He was more of the philosopher. He was a political scientist and loved to reflect upon the political structure of the university. And so it was a nice blend of personalities and talents. I
remember Herb Garfinkel very well. I used to get a lesson in political science every time I went into his office. He was one of the, I think, one of the outstanding characters in the history of our university.
A very, very interesting person. I can still remember one time I was in telling him that something that he was doing was wrong, that it just, was not the right way to do it, and he suddenly stopped me and he says, "Elaine," he said, "sometimes you make me so mad." But he says, "Don't stop doing it." He says, "I need someone every once in a while to tell me when I'm doing something wrong." But he was a very interesting person in the sense that he could recognize that about himself.
Well, a lot of changes took place during his tenure here. Can you remember some of them?
Well, the primary changes were in terms of faculty promotion and tenure, the strengthening of it. It wasn't always very popular. But there was certainly a much, much greater demand in terms of the faculty role. They were expected to do research. It wasn't just enough to simply meet your classes. I guess the phrase that was developed, and I think Herb was probably the first one that used it, it was during that time that UNO made a quantum leap into the future. That was the phrase he used. And it really was a time in which there was a great deal of change. And of course, that was a time in which the university was really growing, and it was a lot easier because you could hire people that were already doing research, which in some ways left some of the old-timers a little bit behind, because they had come during an earlier period in which the primary emphasis was, if you're a good teacher, that's it. But some of these people sort of got left behind, I think, in a way, because the new people that they hired were superior in terms of the traditional academic role of teaching, research, and service. And the older faculty had grown up in a very different kind of environment.
Well, Herb came here as a very distinguished scholar with a national reputation in his field, so he could have been served as a model for other faculty.
And as I say, it was easier for him to do it because simply he had, he'd proved himself, so he, I think, was very good in that sense that he had the freedom, in a sense, the idiosyncrasy credit, in order to impose some of those standards. And really, in a way, they weren't imposed, but yet they were. I mean, here it took someone to bring about this change, and I think it was Herb. And it took a number of faculty who were willing to listen to him and to embrace that change. It couldn't have worked without both.
And then he left after a while, and you had a new boss.
That's right. Actually, he left, I'm trying to remember what year it was. Oh, goodness, it's so long, I've forgotten. Probably about
Was it late 70s or early 80s?
No, it was late 70s. I can't remember exactly what year it was. But he left, went to the University of Louisville. Mm-hmm. By that time, Dr. Roskins had gone down as the president at Lincoln. Dr. Weber came in as chancellor, and Dr. Garfinkel was here 1 year under Chancellor Weber, so that would have made it in about 78 he left, because I think Weber came in 77. For 1 year we had an acting vice chancellor who at that time had been the dean of College of Public Affairs and Community Service, John Kerrigan. And then at that end of that year they hired a new permanent vice chancellor who was Otto Bauer, who came here from Wisconsin, and he was here then during the rest of my administrative tenure, really. And I worked with him all that period of time.
Were there differences in the leadership style of these two people? Did you know, what was it like to work for each of them?
Well, there were certain similarities, there were certain differences. I think Otto had much more administrative experience that Herb had. Otto had been on an ACE fellowship, had been out in Berkeley when they were having all the problems at Berkeley, so he'd had some different kinds of experiences. He, as I say, had probably spent more of his career in administration, but yet in other ways they were very similar. That our relationship in terms of the kinds of things I did versus the kinds of things he did stayed pretty much constant. Although I think probably he was a little more comfortable with some of the technical stuff, or some people have called it administrivia. He was a little more comfortable with that than Herb had been.
You had a good deal of responsibility for budgetary things. You mentioned that was not Herb's forte.
No.
But if I remember correctly, you were also heavily involved in hiring processes and things of that sort.
Yeah, I got involved in that early on, and partly as a result, I suppose, that someone in the office had to review what was happening in terms of hiring. But also at that time, there was, in the federal level, and also the state, there was emphasis upon affirmative action, equal opportunity, and there were certain kinds of things that had to be done centrally in order to meet the reporting requirements of the federal government. And it was going to lodge in some office centrally, and so it was in our office, really, versus the personnel office, because the personnel office did not have much to do with faculty hiring. So I got heavily involved in that, and then I got heavily involved in inter-campus activities associated with hiring. I don't know how many different committees they had over the years in terms of meshing, statistical systems and reporting systems, computerized accounting systems, and I always seemed to get on every one of those committees. In many cases, I always had the feeling that you were reinventing the wheel, because I would be on a committee and 5 years later we'd have a new committee to do the same thing. And of course everybody else was new, and so they were enthusiastic about it, but I had been on the first committee and I was a little cynical about it. Because to a certain extent, things really didn't get solved, but then they were, temporarily solved and then resolved the second time.
In that process that you've just been talking about with various governmental regulations and so on. If I remember correctly, there was from time to time a bit of investigatory work and litigation even. Did you get involved in any of that?
In some of it, although really on the academic side we had remarkably few formal situations. We had one case that ended up in court, in federal court, because it had happened and the people who were involved directly in it were no longer at the university. I ended up being at the university in the federal court. We won the case, but that's the only one that I can remember. Actually, it was a tenure situation that actually reached the court system. We had, of course, the federal government visiting us. It seemed to be one of their biggest complaints was how we kept data and collected data, and whether we could have evidence that they could look at. And that, of course, required someone in a central level to ensure that that was done, because if every college was responsible for their own, I'm sure we would not have had uniform kinds of data and statistics to present to the federal government.
Did that take up a lot of your time?
Off and on. It wasn't a daily thing, but there were periods of time in which it took a great deal of time. And then later on, there was one activity that took a great deal of time when the faculty, when shortly about a year later, well, maybe less than that, when Dr. Bauer got here, the faculty agreed, they voted to unionize. And I was deeply involved. For a long period of time, I was the only representative from the campus that was on the administrative bargaining team, and that took a lot of time. And late night sessions and so on.
You were a very busy person with a very heavy workload. I remember that very well.
I put in long hours. I've always said, I think I was talking to you earlier about, I was one of those early morning people. I always got here very, very early in the morning, and I always laughed because I remember when Dr. Roskins was still the chancellor. He was also a morning person, and I always knew when I managed to beat him, because there was never when I got here before he did, I always knew it because there was no scent of his cigar in the hallway at the administration. This was when we were allowed to smoke, and he smoked these huge, huge cigars, and I could always tell when he'd beat me to campus because I could smell the cigar.
Well, you never had to worry about a parking spot when you get here.
No, I never did. Never had to worry about a parking spot, although, as I say, I think some people were, later, in fact, I shouldn't tell the story, but Dr. Garfinkel, when he hired me, told me the story about a year later about one of the other candidates for the position he had hired me for. And he told me, he said that this person had come in to see him and they'd talked about the job. And he told him about what he wanted and so on, and he finally turned to this person and said, well, do you have any questions? And the person asked him, he said, do I get a reserved parking place? And Dr. Garfinkel told me, he said, well, I decided at that moment that I did not want to hire him, because if those were his values, I just didn't think we'd work out very well together. But since I always got here early, a reserved parking spot was not important to me.
Well, then you retired from that position, from your job as Associate Vice Chancellor, and you went back to teaching sociology.
I went back. I took advantage of what was called the partial retirement policy. There was no such thing as partial retirement in an administrative position, but there was partial retirement in a faculty position, and I went back on a partial retirement basis to the sociology department.
That means you worked half-time. Got paid for half-time.
And got paid for half-time. The only thing that you got out of it was that you got full-time benefits, which was very important, of course. And I went back to sociology, and I'd been there, I think, maybe a year. And
had the department changed much in the meantime?
Oh, yes, considerably. But then the department, the chair of the department decided he didn't want to be chair any longer, and no one else wanted to be chair, and they decided, well, this would be perfect. I could be chair of the department on a half-time basis. And actually, I rather enjoyed it. I didn't think I would, but it was simple, really, after being in another administrative position for years. And it was an interesting job. I think I was fairly successful as chair. I was really surprised. But
I can testify to that since I was dean.
But it was sort of fun. One of the things I did, which I think the person that replaced me didn't like, but I took over all student advising, undergraduate advising. I just decided the students weren't getting good advising, and so I had the chair do it. And I think that they were worried that that was creating a tradition, that the future chair would have to do the advising. But no, I enjoyed being chair of the department.
We skipped over one thing. Let's go back to it for a minute. you had a year as acting dean of fine arts.
Well, but
How
that's
did that
after.
happen?
That's after. I was chair of the department first.
Oh, okay. Yes.
And then the dean of fine arts left. And they decided they really needed to name someone as acting dean who would not be considered for the position on a permanent basis, who wasn't interested in the position on a permanent basis. And because sometimes you put somebody in who might be interested, that creates some hard feelings if they don't get the job. So I was asked to be acting dean of fine arts. And, you know, I have no fine arts background. I think the faculty decided I was okay because I did appreciate the arts, although probably they thought I was a little prone to support music more than the visual arts. But I think they also thought I was, in a sense, my qualification was I had built a harpsichord and donated it to the school or department of music. And
you
they
built
thought,
it?
Yes, I built it.
All by yourself?
Yeah, I didn't play it, but I built it. But they thought, I guess, that was enough to qualify me as to be acting dean of fine arts. And I was there from the time, just when they moved into the new building, which is now the Weber Fine Arts Building. And I had a very good year. I think it was sort of nice. And then they hired a full-time dean and during that time, and I could walk away from it.
Anything especially interesting happened during that year you were?
Oh, there were a few personnel issues that I had to deal with that I don't want to talk about, but it really wasn't that bad of a year. It was, you know, it was probably cleaning up a few situations that should have been addressed before. But I think the college was in pretty good shape when the new dean came in. And I think the faculty were feeling better about themselves. And I think if anything that was accomplished, that they did, in a sense. There was a renewed spirit. And I think that was important for a new dean to come in and get that, or have that available.
You've been retired for several years now. I was amazed how
Yeah, I retired in 1994.
Right.
I surprised
What have you
everyone.
been doing since?
Well, first I moved to Arizona, which I subsequently found out was a mistake, but I retired and moved the same year, and probably both of those events were prompted by the fact that I had a heart attack, and I just decided maybe this was the time to change my life and everything, and so I moved to Arizona, and I didn't like Arizona, and I took a loss financially, having to sell my house there, but I moved back to Omaha after 3 years. So from 94 to 97, for those 3 years I was in Arizona. Was very active in the Nebraska Club in Tucson. We had, in fact, Paul Borghi, who was mentioned earlier at the beginning of this show, was down in Tucson every winter, and I always saw Paul at the football game advance, or when we went to a sports bar and we all watched the games together. And so I was there for 3 years. Then I came back to Omaha in 97, and I've been back ever since. Do a little bit of volunteering. Ex-Chancellor Weber, or Emeritus Chancellor Weber, is the president of the Omaha Community Foundation. So he got me involved as their only volunteer at the foundation. And I've had a good time with it because it's not a traditional kind of volunteer role. What I've been doing is a little more responsible than you'd get, you know, sitting at the information desk at the hospital or something like that. So I've been doing that and trying to keep busy. Don't always keep busy, but I try to.
Well, we're getting fairly close to the end of this interview. Let's maybe talk a little bit about some of the people that you've encountered. We've already done that a bit. We've talked about Vice Chancellor Garfinkel and Dr. Roskins and some others. But are there any memorable characters that you could talk about that we haven't mentioned yet?
Oh, goodness, there are all sorts of people. I did mention briefly Dean Harper, who was Dean of Arts and Sciences when I first came. And as I say, he always made me feel uncomfortable because when I walked down the hall, he'd always ask me, how's the doctorate going, Elaine? Never could avoid that.
He was kind of a mentor for me in some ways because I became department chairman when he was dean, and he helped me over a lot of rough spots.
And I understand he's still alive.
Yes, he is. He's living in Colorado, Estes Park.
And he must be well into his 90s, I would suppose, is he? Or maybe
I'm not quite sure.
I think he would be. But, well, let's see. I don't know. There's some people that I remember, and I still see them, that I can't remember their names. They're people in the campus security and the food service that they seem to remember me. But sometimes I have trouble remembering their names. But they were people here. Were here so long that, you know, you just they were campus fixtures.
rather dedicated people in those
extremely
departments.
So.
Yes.
And I've been so pleased the food service, for example, they've hired some people over there with some handicaps, some of them things like a speech handicap, or in some cases there are some people who have mild cases of retardation. And they've kept them for years and years, and those people feel a real dedication to the food service. I can think of a couple of them that I always see, and they know me. And I've always appreciated that about UNO. I think there's a kind of fraternization, at least there always was earlier, I don't know whether it still exists, across employment categories that was always good. You know, I can know places where the faculty and the janitors never speak to one another or limited. So maybe it's because when I was teaching in high school, I remember the education course I took that I thought was a terrible course, but I did learn one thing. This guy told me, he said, you know, when you go to the high school where you're going to teach, the first person you got to know is the janitor. He says he'll do more for you than anybody else. And that's probably true. But I think there's always been at UNO, at least when I was here, this kind of fraternization across employment categories and this feeling of sort of being one family. It's probably not as strong today as it used to be, simply because it's too large.
Well, as sort of the de facto academic budget officer, you must have had some dealings with our business office, too.
Lots of them. In fact, I still come back and visit some of the people in the business and finance area and the personnel area, because I had so much contact.
Was Harold Kiefover still here?
He was still here. In fact, every once in a while, I would drive the car that was equipped. Harold was, in a wheelchair, and so one of the state cars was equipped for him, all hand controls. And I used to end up getting that car every once in a while and having to drive it to Lincoln to intercampus meetings. But yes, Harold was still here when I was here. And some of these people, though, that were here are still here. Been here for a long time. And Julie Totten was here early on in my career and is still here.
And what was her role? Or is her role?
Well, her role now, I think, is assistant or associate vice chancellor. I don't know, for business and finance. I'm not sure what the title is right now. But
she worked with budgets a lot.
Oh, yes, yeah. Well, she actually, at the beginning, was simply the budget officer, and then she moved up, and they hired a new budget officer. She has been here, I'm going to say, many, many, many years. I was also here during a time in which there were a lot of changes. For example, the international program was first developed while I was first here. In fact, I think it was about 1975 when Tom Gutierrez was hired to be chair of the Afghanistan program. And the reason he was hired is actually we had a faculty member in geography that was going to head it up, and he died very suddenly, Chris Young. And they hired Tom Gutierrez, and from then on, of course, the international program has grown leaps and bounds. But that was all started in about 1975 via this Afghanistan program. And, of course, I've known a lot of people in those areas, too, over the years, visitors and so on. The Afghan ambassador to the U.S. and all sorts of visiting dignitaries from Afghanistan, well, before the Taliban were in control over there. And as you know, you went over there. I never was lucky enough to be sent over there. I was just here to meet them when they got off the boat.
But you have done a good bit of traveling.
Yeah, on my own kind of thing. I went to Europe a number of times, or I've gone to Europe a number of times. I think probably at this point I probably should see more of the United States. I've probably seen more countryside in Europe than I have. I laugh. I lived in Arizona for 3 years, and I've never seen the Grand Canyon. So
you should have joined me in
well, that's what I was told.
Last July.
That's what I was told. But I said I don't know that I have the stamina anymore to go rafting down the river.
I think, well, Mary Williamson did it.
She did.
Professor Williamson.
Oh, well.
She was the one that talked me into it.
That was a number of years ago, I think she did it. So, but no, I was contacted this year and was told that you had an opening, and it was good. There was a good cheap rate too to even go. But I decided no, I wasn't in any kind of shape.
For our audience's benefit, I've been sponsoring kind of raft trips through the Grand Canyon for several times,
and they're well known.
Talk some faculty members into joining me.
Yeah, they're well known. And Jack Newton's trips down the Grand Canyon.
Well, let's see. You've known a number of chancellors. I think we've talked about all of them, starting with Dr. Trewick and then Dr. Naylor and
then Dr. Roskins and Dr. Weber.
Dr. Weber. Yeah. Oh, there was a. Was it? Were you? Were you here when Vic Blackwell was acting?
Oh yes, yeah, that's right. He was here. He was acting chancellor for a short time before
Dr. Roskins.
Yeah, came in. He was. That's right. After Kirk Naylor was no longer president, then Vic Blackwell was acting for I think about a year.
Right, and so Dr. Blackwell was at the time Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and then they kind of tapped him for the job of acting chancellor until until Dr. Roskins came on the scene.
And Dr. Roskins came in 1972, I think it was 72 or 73. It may have been mid-year. I can't remember now.
But that was before you were in the Vice Chancellor's
Yeah, it would have been
office, so
72 because it was in 73 when he asked me if I wanted to go to Ann Arbor. So he had been here about a year. He came in 72.
There were a lot of people in the Chancellor's office that you must have come in contact with. For example, how about Charlie Hine?
Charlie Hine was assistant to the Chancellor, executive assistant to the Chancellor, I believe was his title. He was there for years and years and years. There was also a person then that replaced him, who was named Bill Schneider, who was an ex-Army or Air Force colonel. I can't remember now. He was here for a few years. Rex Engebretson, who was in the Chancellor's office in charge of planning, physical plant planning mainly. I think those were the primary ones that were associated
During your
with
time as Vice Chancellor, or Associate Vice Chancellor, there were, speaking of physical plant, there were lots and lots of changes on the campus.
Oh yes, and the job I always got, I don't know why they decided that I was to do this, but I was forever heading up committees on space allocation, which was probably...
And parking, I remember.
Yeah, parking, but space allocation was one of the difficult ones because you always were going to step on somebody's toes when you decided who was going to get office space here or there. And but we were forever doing that because we were having to move people all the time, and it's still going on. You know, they've got people now moved out because they're remodeling Arts and Sciences Hall. But the problem was earlier we never had any flex room. We didn't have any space. At least now they have the engineering building where they can put some people temporarily, but we didn't have that. And in fact, in some cases we were putting people in temporary, you know, Quonset huts and this kind of thing. But, oh yes, I got involved with parking, I got involved with all sorts of strange things associated. You wouldn't think it had anything to do with academic affairs, but I would get involved in them. I ended up chairing the committee once, search committee to select a new athletic director. But they decided it was sort of a political role, and maybe I could, you know, mediate between some of the groups that might be represented on the committee. But
that must have been an interesting experience.
It was. It was different. It was carried out a little differently than academic hiring is. It's you know, if a position is announced, a coach leaves or an athletic director leaves, immediately people know about it all over the United States. And people start applying for it before you've ever advertised. Or you start getting letters from people, oh, you ought to consider this person or that person. It's very different. It's less open in some ways than faculty hiring. But that's just the way it operates, you know. It operates that way every place in the United States.
But still open in the sense that you do advertise and everybody knows about it and can apply.
But there are people that think they have an inside track on the job. I remember when the committee I handed up, there was a person who really thought he was going to get the job from the very minute he called and asked, you know, about the position, and very upset when he didn't. But it's, you know, I got involved, as I say, in some things that you really wouldn't think belonged in academic affairs, but you had to be versatile and serve in different roles.
Well, can you think of anything else that that you want to reminisce about? Well, we have, they're just telling me 4 minutes left here, so...
Oh, I don't know. There were always the kinds of personnel issues that came up, in some cases dealing with information that was pretty private. That was always a difficult job. There were things that became associated with the media, for example. I remember one case that took a lot of time was when we found a faculty member who had forged credentials claiming they had a doctorate from a British university. And that hit the press, and we had to deal with that and had to do the sleuthing to find out whether he really had the doctorate or not, which was an interesting experience, especially because it was an overseas degree.
If I remember correctly, somebody went to the library at that university overseas and found that he had even sneaked a card in the card catalog there for his dissertation.
It was unbelievable. It would have been very hard to detect if it hadn't been for some information that had come up. But no, there was some indication that this person had some help over there. But you know, I remember Otto Bauer talked to this little woman in the library at this school in London who was very, very upset that anybody could have, you know, defaced her library by inserting a card in the card catalog. But yeah, there were plenty of those cases, plenty of cases like that. Well, none quite as exciting, I suppose, but interesting cases. Anybody that deals with personnel knows that they will end up with some interesting cases once in a while.
Oh, you were telling me earlier, we talked about being here early and getting a parking spot. You were telling me,
oh, well, yeah.
I thought that was a funny story.
Oh, you mean about the handicap ones?
Yeah.
Well, one time I remember Professor Petrosky in the history department came up to me, and I'd always parked in the same parking spot because I got here early, and it was sort of known that was my parking spot. It didn't say it had my name on it, but it was mine.
But nobody else was there that early to park there.
But one day Professor Petrosky came up to me, and he said, "What are you doing parked in a handicap parking spot?" I said, "I'm not parked in a handicap parking spot. I'm parked in the same spot." He said, "Well, you're in a handicap parking spot." So he got a little I got a little upset. I said, "Bill, come on, what are you talking about?" So I went outside and looked, and sure enough, during the day, when my car was there, they had put this handicap sign right in front of my car.
But at least you didn't get towed.
No. They knew who it was, and they left it there. But my parking spot had been lost now to. This was when handicap parking spots were first being put in. So I lost my favorite parking spot.
I guess we're about here at the end of our time together. I want to thank you for taking the time today to sit down with me and reminisce a little bit. I've enjoyed it. I hope you have too.
I've always enjoyed reminiscing. It's been very enjoyable.
So, and to our audience, I want to thank you for joining us today in a visit with Dr. Elaine Hess, longtime professor, assistant professor of sociology and associate vice chancellor for academic affairs. We've been taking a look at some of the history of UN Omaha as seen through the eyes of the history makers. This is Jack Newton inviting you to join us again in the series we call Reflections in Time.
Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.